So, good evening, everyone. My name is Siobhan O'Sullivan. I'm the Executive Director here at the Royal Irish Academy. I'm delighted to welcome you all here for this evening's discussion. I think it's going to be a really, really interesting evening. It's not often that you can sell tax. It can be difficult as a subject, but I'm delighted to see so many people come out because I think we're talking about tax in a slightly different context this evening and really looking at it through a kind of social lens around fiscal taxation, the fiscal social contract, what do we owe to each other, and all those kind of really very difficult but interesting and important questions. And we're really delighted to be able to host this event in the Royal Irish Academy where this kind of discourse is exactly what we want to engender. I want to thank the Department of Finance for their support in actually organising this event. And as I say, delighted to have you all here. We are really honoured to have a very, very prestigious panel to discuss this issue with us. And I'm going to step down now and let our moderator, Alison O'Connor, take us from here. And thank everybody for coming and thank very much our panellists and Alison for agreeing to moderate. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. Good evening, everyone. As Siobhan said, a very distinguished panel who I already know from speaking to them have some really interesting things to say. So I'll just get on with it with my introductions. Right beside me here is Professor Niamh Maloney. Niamh is Professor of Law at LSE Law School, but more pertinently this evening, she is Chair of the Independent Commission on Taxation and Welfare. Niamh is an honorary member of the Royal Irish Academy, a Fellow of the British Academy, and was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Zurich. She specialises in EU financial markets regulation and wrote the first monograph on this topic, EU Securities and Financial Markets Regulation. She has written a number of other books and is an editorial board member of several journals, including the European Law Review. Niamh regularly contributes to parliamentary hearings on financial regulations, including recently on Brexit and financial services. Right beside Niamh there is Professor Mary Murphy. Mary is Head of Department and Professor in the Department of Sociology, Maynooth University, with research interests in eco-social welfare, gender, care and social security, globalisation and welfare states, and power and civil society. Mary has published widely in leading journals and co-edited The Irish Welfare State in the 21st Century, Challenges and Changes, and Policy Analysis in Ireland 2020. Her sole-authored forthcoming book, Creating an Eco-Social Future, will be published by Policy Press in May 2023. An active advocate for social justice and gender equality, she was appointed to the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission from 2013 to 2017 and is currently a member of the Council of State in Ireland. I was reflecting earlier that there's nothing like academic biographies to make you feel insecure at yourself. And finally, we have Brian Nolan. Last but not least, Brian is Professor of Social Policy at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention. He's Director of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, Employment, Equity and Growth Programme, and Senior Research Fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford. He was previously Principal of the College of Human Sciences and Professor of Public Policy at University College Dublin. Brian is an economist by training with a doctorate from the London School of Economics, and his main area of research are income inequality, poverty, and the economics of social policy. He's been centrally involved in a range of collaborative cross-country research networks and projects, including the Growth Inequalities Impacts Gini multi-country research project. Amongst others, he co-edited the Handbook of Economic Equality. Brian currently leads the Oxford Martin Programme on Inequality and Prosperity, established in 2016 with Citi. And Niamh and Brian were just chatting earlier about the weekly commute that they undertake to the UK, and it doesn't get any easier apparently. Now, I'm going to invite Professor Niamh Maloney. Each of our panellists is going to speak first, and we will have a discussion afterwards, and there will be time for questions as well. So I'm going to invite Niamh to speak first.
Thanks much, Alison. Will I stay here?
Whichever you're happiest.
I'll stay here. Thank you so much. And it's just fantastic to be here this evening in this absolutely sort of wonderful room. So thanks very much to the RIA, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of all the Commission members. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to discuss the report and our findings in this kind of context, so thank you. And just before I kind of speak as chair, if I could just speak for a second, Alison, as an academic lawyer, because I'm neither a tax person nor a welfare person. But when you think about it, for me, there were so many touch points, because tax, from my perspective, is a set of rules. There are very significant touch points in that regard with sort of the day job. But if I might, if it's okay with you, just go back to the report and sort of frame it a little bit for this evening's discussion. I think it's worth articulating that question we were asked to answer, because that really does sort of frame everything. And it does come back to the social good theme you mentioned, Alison. So, how best can the tax and welfare systems support economic activity and promote increased employment and prosperity, while ensuring there are sufficient resources available to meet the costs of the public services and supports in the medium and long term. So that's really going to this heart of what do we owe each other, how do we get there, how do we pay for it, how do we organise ourselves. But we were asked to do it in a very particular way. So we had a very extensive terms of reference, and again, I think our terms of reference resonate with the notion of a social contract with a social good, because we were looking at the sustainability of both systems and having regard to a series of challenges. Now, what I find interesting about this social good, social contract dimension is many of these are universal, and any advanced economy globally is dealing with, for example, aging demographics, COVID and the changing patterns of work, the green transition, and so on. So we had all of those to frame our work, but then there were the very specific domestic challenges, and specifically the housing crisis. So all of this sort of framed how we were looking at this question. And as we went about our work, I think the scale of the touch points really became apparent very quickly between individuals and the state. And the choices, you know, the fact that tax and welfare speak to really fundamental choices as to how we shape the relationship between individuals and the state, and how we articulate this sort of common set of obligations. But I also think this notion of a fiscal compact or a social contract resonates with how we were constituted and how we went about our work. So we were designed as a broad group of stakeholders. It was a commission of sort of 12, a representative group in many respects, so not like a citizens' assembly, so it was a smaller group. And it obviously had an expert quality, it had technocratic quality. But nonetheless, to me, it plays to this notion of consent, assent, to this idea of why and when we pay tax and what we expect to get out of it. So I think this notion of representative groups that every so often take a pulse on how these systems work really underscores the fact that these are social contract systems. They essentially operate via consent from those who are subject to them. So I think they're very valuable exercises. And as part of this, of course, we did a huge consultation, Your Vision, Our Future, as a sort of a pulse on how people were thinking about tax and welfare. And then just finally and very briefly, you know, where did we land in terms of the TOR and this very broad question we had to answer? Well, I think the first thing to note is a bit of context maybe, Alison, because if you look back over the generations here, and I see Donald Butler here, which is marvellous, but commissions at different times sort of engage with, reflect back where society is at that moment. So in the 1980s, the de Butler Commission was obviously at a time where tax and the POE system was of major societal concern. Then in 2009, of course, we have the Daly Commission, which is really grappling with, certainly as it went sort of in the later phases of its work, with a huge economic crisis. We came into the system, I think, at a period when the structures of the state had gone through a major challenge and come out of it very well. So COVID, the pivoting of the tax system to pay out supports, the fact that we had the fiscal resilience to cope with the pandemic. So in many respects, we were looking at a sort of a well-functioning, very stable system. But our job was to look into the future. And that was sort of the pressure point, if you like, the medium to long term in all of this. The challenges we were facing in terms of aging demographics, the green transition, and so on. And these are not just challenges for the tax and welfare systems. They're also challenges societally and for social cohesion, for intergenerational equity. So while we were dealing with, I think, a very stable, very resilient system, we were very much looking to the future. Because I think sometimes when I look at sort of current analysis and current reporting about the tax system, of course we're in a very strong position, and tax receipts are soaring in so many directions, and yet that's not where we were. We were looking medium to long term. Now, when you look medium to long term, you do see all the challenges. So just, I think as everybody in the room knows, our biggest finding was we needed to be a net revenue raising commission. I mean, if you look to the UK experience, the Merlees report, which was done a number of years ago, was their last major review of tax, and they were revenue neutral. So they were trying to tweak the system while remaining revenue neutral. We were not. And that was a powerful decision we made early on, based on evidence, based on looking into the future, based on challenges. And to come up with 116 recommendations that framed how you get there, we had 5 core principles. And if I may very briefly, Alison, they were sustainability, including but not only fiscal sustainability, reciprocity. And I think a key phrase, if I may bring out from our exec summary, was social cohesion and intergenerational equity depend on the tax and welfare systems, including and supporting everyone. Because we are in a world, to use the phrase, of wicked problems, massive challenges. So that sense of reciprocity and relatedly solidarity, very important to our work. Adequacy, the third one. Very much a theme from the welfare side of our mandate. Equity, including intergenerational equity, and efficiency. So those 5 principles, our overarching sense that we need to bring in more revenue to meet our needs, framed our report. And we, if I can just summarise, it's broaden the base, make it as wide as possible, make it as resilient as possible, and in particular, draw more on the basis other than income. So wealth, capital, property. So that essentially is the answer to the question we were asked by government. And there's 116 recommendations, they're the sub-answers, if you like, but that's broadly where we landed. And it'd be very interesting to have the conversation now as to what that tells us about the nature of the social contract we were grappling with.
Thank you very much, Niamh. I think that's a really good foundation with which to kick off the evening. Mary.
Okay, I'll stay here as well if that's the mood. So first of all, just to thank people for the invitation to be here. I'm really delighted to acknowledge all the work in putting together the event, and to acknowledge all the work on the Commission on Tax and Welfare, and to particularly welcome it. I was at a consultation that the Department of Social Protection had last week, looking at whether or not they would bring back in pay-related benefit. And there was a lot of talk about, well, why did we abolish it to begin with? And it turned out it was a recommendation of the Commission on Social Welfare in 1986 to take it out. And it had taken a good 10 years for that recommendation to swing through. And then we find ourselves reflecting on that and saying, well, maybe we'll bring it back in. And I suppose it just reminded me 2 things. One, how important these things are. They do become our benchmarks and our Bibles, and we do go back to them again and again. But also how long they last in terms of framing the common sense understanding of where we're going with things. So they're really important in that sense. So I think that medium to long-term frame is actually where it should be, and it's actually how it will be used in the longer run. And I think it is worth noting that the previous Commission on Taxation in 2009 actually had revenue neutrality itself as a principle. So it's not inevitable. It's not a given common sense that revenue raising would be at the heart of a recommendation. So I think it is really important and welcome that the net revenue raising is framing the overall approach of the Commission, as well as the 5 principles that you said, but also that there are revenue policy choices available that are consistent with the principles of sustainability that are outlined. That's really important as well, because it's not just a wish kind of a frame, it's actually getting down into the brass tacks that the 116 recommendations to some degree are consistent with those principles that you mentioned, and that's really important. Because of course those kind of the revenue to tax to fund public services is the essential pin of it, but also social cohesion, as you mentioned, and intergenerational equity, as well as carbon neutral economies and just transitions and the rest of it. And I think framing it as a fiscal consensus or a social contract is really important, and I suppose that's pushing on to get a public's understanding and a citizen civic understanding of that correlation between taxation and public services, and to trust that relationship between taxation and public services is really important. And there is evidence that the public do trust that. I mean, I think recent citizens' assemblies were also quite progressive on been inclined to increase taxation for social good and to achieve certain progressive goals, and that's really, really good. There's also evidence, I think, that the Commission is in tune with a lot of other analysis, not only from the likes of Oxfam, which are focusing on wealth taxes as a way of addressing global inequalities, but also the European Central Bank, the IMF, millionaires and billionaires and tax we trust. You know, like it's hitting a moment where this debate is really important globally. But just in terms of trying to unpack the social contract idea and going back to the principles of sustainability, reciprocity, adequacy, equity and efficiency, and I particularly welcome the adequacy, having campaigned around that issue for a long time, and the need to have those institutional mechanisms to benchmark and indexation, and on equity, the focus there is on individualisation of tax and welfare. I really welcome that aspect of it, and I think they are closely aligned to the social contract. But I think above all, it's the principle of reciprocity that we need to drill down into in terms of understanding, and that the Commission does recognise reciprocity at the heart of how they understand the tax and welfare system, and how tax can be used in that sense, I think is really, really important. But I think that there's things that we can do to maybe deepen that understanding of what reciprocity is in the context of it being a social good, and in the context of what we need to do to expand how we understand reciprocity in the context of the global challenges that you talked about maybe. Like I was on the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and there's a fairly well-developed understanding of taxation and its relationship to human rights and the obligations that states have to maximise available resources in order to progressively realise human rights. And I'm going to contradict myself a little bit now here, because human rights are understood to be quite individual based, and I think the real challenge that we have in thinking about reciprocity and social contracts is to move on from the idea maybe of the social contract as a contract between the individual and the state, because I think what we really need to do is understand better our reciprocal obligations to each other as a society, and in that context to understand the role of the state as the revenue raiser. And I think we've quite a bit to do there to reformulate our understanding of a social contract that's based less maybe on individual rights and obligations and more on mutual interdependence and the concept of collective reciprocity. And I say that because I think by affirming values of individualism and independence, that we miss the big picture about how we need to equip ourselves to respond to those societal challenges that we're facing, and particularly the climate change and everything involved with that. So I think the idea of a new type of social settlement, that we reimagine what reciprocity is in the context of our global social and environmental challenges, and maybe that means that we talk about tax and welfare outside of the construct of a nation state and a social contract that's based on an understanding of the individual and the nation state. Maybe a wider interpretation that allows us to talk more about a moral economy, a care-centred economy, and I think that would open up, not as a critique of the present Commission on Tax and Welfare, but just where the conversation needs to develop towards in terms of how we need to understand what needs to happen. And I suppose that's something that I try and do a little bit in my new book, and I know the session organisers for today were keen to talk about, in the context of polycrisis or permacrisis and the real societal challenges that we're facing now, how can we rethink fiscal policy to ensure a social contract that really is equipped for the future? And I suppose if we think of global inequality and social degradation, environmental degradation as two sides of the same coin to some degree, there is so much that tax policy can do to both equip us with the revenue on the one hand to address societal challenges, but also to address inequality as a fundamental cause of overconsumption and environmental degradation. And I think bringing tax more firmly into that discussion is something that we need to do. And it requires us to be imaginative, I think, to be open, to be institutionally open, to have policy imagination, and to try and reimagine work, time, care, income, participation, tax and welfare in that context, because tax and welfare institutions are incredibly important, both in framing our values and in giving us the vehicles that we need to realise those values. So I do think that there's challenges facing us in the future around that. I think one of the biggest ways that it would happen in relation to maybe both tax but particularly welfare is to move us away from individually meeting our needs through income supports and money per se, and focusing much more on collective universal basic services as a way of us collectively getting our needs met, because they are much more environmentally fundamental in terms of what we need to do to reduce overall consumption. So I think in that sense, you know, there's some of the recommendations in a practical sense to look at tax reliefs and tax exemptions, which do fund the private consumption of services that we need to meet our needs. That's a good way to have that conversation about replacing tax reliefs with universal basic services. I think that's a much more sustainable kind of approach to go. So I think if we move in that direction, that reciprocity, if it's understood that way, it's not necessarily seen as a burden or in the language of obligations or mutual obligations, which can be quite negative, but it can be framed as a necessary enabling value and institutions to help us live the best life we can and have the best planet that we can. And we can see taxation in the same light, that we see it as a valuable social institution and an expression of our commitment to each other and to our planet. That's where I'd like to see it going.
Super, Mary. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Great.
Brian, thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here and appreciate the invitation. And I'd absolutely want to start by congratulating the Commission and saying what a good service they've done to us all and to the national debate. I mean, the tax and social welfare systems are at the heart of the social contract, to connect to the theme for today. And the Commission, you know, argues this point very effectively. So I'd really like to congratulate the members, Secretariat and Niamh as Chair in particular, for what's a major contribution to the debate, and one that I think will very definitely be long lasting, as were the other earlier ones that Mary and I, alas, remember. Yeah. So you know, I don't think we're going to be able to do anything like justice here tonight, and I certainly can't in a few remarks, to the very wide range of topics that it engages with and recommendations that it makes. So let me just give you a few reflections to kick it off on things that struck me, including dogs that didn't bark, or that didn't bark as loudly as I might perhaps have anticipated that they would. So to start with, the recommendations being based on the argument and the belief that the total tax yield will have to increase as a share of national income. I think the arguments are compelling, particularly in terms of aging population. But it would be certainly interesting to know how widespread the consensus about that is in the country. Maybe we'll only know when people end up going to the ballot box. But it isn't at all clear to me what attitudes in the population are about this, and whether this starting point would be widely accepted. And this is obviously something that's very hotly contested elsewhere, in countries where the social fabric indeed is manifestly fraying. Second point would be that, again, which the Commission absolutely recognises and emphasises, is that while we have to worry about the tax and welfare system in combination, and I think it's very helpful that they were indeed considered as such in this report, the missing and enormously important part of the picture is all the other things that tax pays for. And that if social fabrics are fraying, it may be as much about that as it is about perceptions about the way the tax system, for example, is operating. And I think that also applies when we think about progressivity. And when progressivity is not simply a value that we care about for the tax system, it's for the entire tax and spend system. And indeed, the spending side of the ledger does much of the heavy lifting in that respect. It's who benefits as well as who pays. So if we focus on the need to broaden the tax base, that's the rationale for doing that, as the Commission does, is that we want to limit the need for increases in tax rates for reasons that maybe aren't fully articulated. But let's accept that for a minute, and to shift the balance of taxation away from taxes on labour and toward taxes on capital, wealth and consumption. So in the context of previous reports and similar reports elsewhere, some mentioned, I think in many respects you'd characterise the approach that the Commission take as relatively conservative rather than radical in terms of structures. And this includes things that it considers and rejects, or doesn't recommend, perhaps to be fairer, such as a net wealth tax on the agenda internationally now, after years of not being. Universal basic income, again, much discussed and debated. These are not recommended. When it comes to the income tax system, the changes that are recommended, I think you'd probably characterise as rather modest as well. And this is despite the fact that the report notes that the exclusion of large numbers of people from the personal tax and USC systems is increasingly problematic. But the reforms suggested focus on broadening the PRSI base and enhancing the social insurance fund. Again, I think there's a case to be made that should be the priority. But reversing the base erosion in income tax over and above the measures that do that are proposed, you could see perhaps as a complement rather than an alternative to strengthening PRSI, for which I think the arguments are very strong and well made. Starting from the evidence that the share of taxation from property and wealth in the Irish case is low, and the notion that it has to increase, this is the area where the Commission makes recommendations that are more radical. Recommendations are advanced to increase the yield from capital gains tax and capital acquisitions tax, as well as from taxes on land and property. Now, I imagine we'll come back to this in the discussion, and I wouldn't want, the temptation is always to focus on the things that maybe you're not entirely in agreement with, to the neglect of all the things that you agree with. But I think, particularly in the area of capital acquisitions tax, which we can misname as inheritance tax, I think the Commission makes, it goes big. And I think it's no surprise that this is an area that got a lot of attention in the immediate reception. So I've things to say about that I haven't time to say now, but hopefully will. I think it may be overambitious. Turning briefly to the social welfare side of the ledger, and I haven't left myself much time, but then I think possibly that's a reflection of the Commission's, where the Commission ended up as well, in that the Commission's treatment of taxation is rather more extensive than its treatment on the social welfare side. There's a very helpful discussion of adequacy, which Mary mentioned, where I think there's very useful discussion about processes, but of course ultimately setting social welfare rates, no government is going to hand away the capacity to set social welfare rates, and that's a reality that I think we have to work within. There are very interesting proposals for restructuring of working age social welfare supports, that I think need to be fleshed out and will very valuably be fleshed out. And let me just end with a dog that didn't bark perhaps quite as much as I thought it might. And that's the related point that the extent to which we actually want to use that it's wise to use the tax system to try and nudge and push and shove people in particular directions, and the extent to which trying to do so creates what can be considered either tax expenditures or, less politely, holes in the tax system, and the extent to which broadening the tax base can target those expenditures as a core objective, in the belief that many of them are no longer serving the purpose for which they were initially designed. The Commission has extremely valuable suggestions to make about enhancing the processes around tax expenditures, but it doesn't put tax expenditures quite so directly in the firing line as perhaps other reports of this sort have. And I think that takes me back to one of the values that underlies it, which is equity and the perception that people who are equally placed should be paying the same tax, which is absolutely recognised and given a role in the report. But I think for carrying through the implications of that for how we treat tax expenditures is work to be done that the recommendations in the Commission would really help us to do in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. Plenty of food for thought there. Niamh, I'm going to start with you, and as I said, there will be an opportunity for questions from the floor afterwards. And you said there in your contribution that the Commission reflects back, where society is at, ageing demographics, etc. Brian mentioned there are certain parts of it of the report that hit the headlines. I'm not sure whether those were. I'm curious as to whether, I know there were particular reasons why certain things did, but when you were at the end, did you go through and think, well, here's what's going to here's what's going to be a highlight or slightly controversial. But what I'm trying to get at, I suppose, is how much was on your mind about our maturity as a society in our discussion on tax, and where you feel we're at there. I suppose if we start with that, and how that informed your role.
Yeah, that's a great question, Alison, and I think it ties particularly with Brian's comments, but also Mary's as well. So I might kind of answer it in a couple of ways, just when I'm gathering all my thoughts on this. So I think the first thing I would say is one of the challenges any body like this faces is they're kind of the third rails of what we discuss. I mean, tax and welfare are meaningful, and they are meaningful because they are visibly distributional. You see the consequence. You raise a rate, you lower a rate, so that they're absolutely visibly distributional. On the other hand, distribution is the job of politics, and that's where it has to be. It is representative, it is where the choices are made. And yet, we're in this space whereby we're supporting that process, if you like, but we're not a political body. So going to Brian's point, absolutely, there are huge questions here about expenditure, but also about actual levels, actual rates, actual how much yield do we want on X. So we sort of had to navigate that territory whereby we weren't going politically into that space, but we were, as a representative / technocratic group, looking into the future and sort of trying to clean up, be resilient, clean up system, make it as resilient as possible. And I think that's where your point then comes in, Alison, because of course we don't operate in a vacuum. I mean, the political economy of the choices we make is incredibly important. And I suppose the other point related to that is, we were a commission of 12 people. With different views, with different backgrounds, with different perspectives. So all of this is going into the mix. So I suppose what I'd say is we're not scientific in that there is a result out there and we're trying to get to the right result. What we're trying to do is, with as much evidence as we have and an awareness of the political economy, and I think also building. I mean, Mary spoke very much about it. She mentioned the kind of things we were building on. I think you're building step on step on step. And of course, as you build, you're aware of political economy, what worked, what didn't work, and where might we land. So absolutely, we're conscious of that.
But even outside of political economy, I suppose, is that it's essentially advising on, and as you said, it's into the medium term and longer, advising the people advising the government on how the money of the people of Ireland should be spent. And what I'm trying to get at, I suppose, is your sense of how the people of Ireland take to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this, it plays out in this big notion of trust, I think. Yeah. So big,
and I suppose particularly in as Mary was talking about polycrisis, the environment that we exist in currently.
So yeah, I mean, I think my sense is, and this is sort of a personal sense, that I think there's a lot of sort of hair-rending about trust in institutions and trust in the West and trust in politics generally. Excuse me. But I do think the pandemic, Alison, was an inflection point. My sense is that the pandemic showed us the capacity of the state to intervene for good. So it helped us, I think, in that I think, there is a certain societal sense that there is a role for the state, and the state is getting bigger. So I think there is an appreciation that the state is not shrinking, it is getting bigger, and I don't think that's changing. So these are not it's not a palatable outcome, you've got to pay for that. But I think we have the space to have that debate. Okay. How are we going to pay for that?
Okay. Would you agree with that, Mary? Do you think that, because the state certainly has gotten bigger, and it's the discussion at the moment, what's going to be announced this week, even in terms of cost of living package, and acceptance that therefore, you know, it will have to be paid for, and there's a lot of talk about it being spending that's not going to recur. You know, but where we're at in terms of that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we should be able to draw on some poll evidence, you know, and behavioural surveys too. But there actually aren't that many that give us the answer to that. But those that there are would show quite a bit of economic literacy and a sense that people have some inflection points. And the pandemic certainly, I do think it made people aware of the reciprocal relationships that we have to each other and the role of the state, and maybe put some more of a global frame on some of our vulnerability. But we don't see that now in the more recent debate on emigration coming through particularly well, although maybe we will, you know, maybe that debate is emerging. So I think there is quite a bit about, I think that the issue of trust does seem to go quite a bit in terms of saying, well, I would pay more tax if I trusted what was going to be done with it. But I think the other thing that comes out very clearly is that a lot of polls show that people would want more tax, but not for them. Like, you know, they think maybe the rich should be taxed more, but they don't think they're the rich. And this is going back decades, that Irish people's concept of who the rich are has never been that it's the people in this room, for example. It's always the somebody else. And therefore people are looking for more tax, but believe they won't be the ones that would have to take that hit. So there's some hard conversations to be had there.
How do you think that's addressed by the Commission, and how it might be, you know, further developed?
I'm not sure how well it's addressed by the Commission in terms of making it aware of where pitch points would fall, where certain distributional decisions to be made. But I think there have been some very interesting work done by, say, for the likes of TAS, the think tank for Action and Social Change, who did a lot of work prior to the last crisis on looking at what the actual income distribution was in Ireland and making people, and I used it a lot in the classroom, just getting students to think about what your mum and dad earn, where does that put you in the income distribution? And people were looking at it going, yeah, we're rich, you know, and they didn't think of themselves that way at all. But when they looked at it relative to other people, they realised where they were. And I think there is quite a lot of interesting things that we could do to have that conversation in a bigger way, which would make people then have to think about the aspirations they have for tax changes that would impact on them. That would be interesting.
Brian, you touched on some of the controversy, which I suppose was the hot, and I'll use the more journalistic, the inheritance tax issue, and that this was the hot button issue that was very easily pressed. And I suppose that kind of gets to the heart as well about the intergenerational thing, the reciprocity, and how you know, why should people be told you know, how their money should be spent, or what if when I die my children inherit, you know, that how much they should have to pay, or an increase in that. How do you communicate that to people?
I'm not sure I'm best placed to answer the communication side of it. But I think the underlying principle in framing taxation is that you want to spread the burden as widely as you can, and the Commission very much operated on that basis. And if we look at how much countries in general have been able to raise via wealth taxes in general, and let's call it it's intergenerational transfers, I guess, rather than just inheritance, but let's call it inheritance for short. And inheritance taxes in particular, I think you'd have to take it that there is there's a limit to how far you can push inheritance taxes. And just to characterize the Irish situation, Currently, there's nothing very unusual about the amount of revenue we raise from inheritance tax. It's sort of around the middle of the rich countries. Many rich countries have seen their take from those types of taxes fall very rapidly in recent years. Some have abolished those sorts of taxes. We haven't. The tax take has held up. There was an interesting report from an EU research outfit called the Joint Research Centre there quite recently, projecting how much inheritance there would be to tax in a number of EU countries, including Ireland. And it came up with the interesting stat that over the next 15 to 20 years, there would be, the amount to be taxed would more than double. So I think there's grounds for thinking that that we can indeed raise the revenue because the base will have increased. But is there an appetite for a radical change in the regime, in particular for taxing children receiving from their parents? I would need to be convinced that there was such an appetite, let's put it that way. The proposals made by the Commission are for a very, very sharp reduction in the threshold over which you pay a third, a tax rate of 33%. I think you wouldn't need such a marked reduction to have a significant increase in the tax take, given the increase in the base. So I think there is more revenue to be raised there, but that's not. But the contribution that can make to our overall need to the objective as set out by the Commission of substantially enhancing the tax base, I think the contribution is quite limited, and therefore I think it'd be a real pity if that's where the conversation focused, having just focused the conversation on it myself, but there you go.
Well, I led you to it. Niamh, I'm going to want to just go to Niamh now, and then we'll go to the floor. And my question, and answer might be different in retrospect, was what was the most difficult thing for the Commission to grapple with? And I suppose the bit I would add on there is that as chair and being asked to do that service for your country, but then facing controversy afterwards, maybe you would address that a little bit and what that experience is like, or what advice you might give to people in your position in the future.
Thanks, Alison. So non-controversial questions. Look, on the first one, I think it's a really good question. I think, and first of all, we had an absolutely heroic group of people. I mean, I cannot pay enough tribute to Commission members who brought sort of energy and purpose and a great sort of objectivity to our exercise, and a fabulous secretariat, and Dr. Colin Murridgen is here who led it, so it's very important to pay tribute to them. My sense, Alison, is the hardest thing was getting our hands around it. In terms of what is it we're being asked, and how can we feasibly answer it in a year. So I think it was sort of the scale of the exercise, you know.
To my mind, that looked huge.
Yeah, and it was. And it was. And I don't think I'm telling tales out of school to say it. At the beginning, I think we were all just sort of absolutely, you know, sort of dazzled, starstruck. I mean, I remember my colleagues at LSE reading it and going, well, I can't think of anything else that might have been in there that wasn't. How on earth are you going to navigate your way through this? So yeah, I mean, I think there was this, but I think that had, in many ways, I think, Alison, in some ways, I don't want to use the word it protected us, but it gave us a very sharp sense of, we have to figure out a way through this. You know, you cannot go line by line through the tax code with that kind of GOR. Not going to happen. So it allowed us to pull up. You know, it allowed us to pull up to the system, and it encouraged us to think in terms of normative questions, to think in terms of principles. But I think that was the real challenge, in working our way through that. I mean, secondly, in terms of sort of the challenges of sort of when the report comes out and it lands, I mean, I think it very much goes to Brian's point. You know, none of this is in a vacuum. This is all, you know, big P politics. And look, I suppose from my perspective, if you think about even the timing, right? So when we were established back in April 2021, I hope I've got my right year here, You're coming off the back of COVID, a sense of what the state can do, the power of the state. Reel forward to September 2022, and you're looking at a cost of living crisis. Nobody wants to hear about tax increases. And even going to Brian's point about the challenges about particular bits of the tax base, none of the tax base is palatable now to be touched. So that was a very difficult landing zone to be in, and you know, we had to navigate around that. But I think going to the wider point, look, in terms of me doing it and my reaction to it, I'm in the business of, I work in a university. If you're having a conversation, you've done something right. And I don't mean that in any kind of trite way. I think it's actually profound. I remember that week, my husband in the morning would say, well, you're in the following newspapers. And I said, oh, well, but this is great. You know, it's having the conversation.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, thank you. So we're going to have some questions now. I think there's a roving mic. So if you want to just ask a question generally, we can see who'd like to take it. Or if you want to specifically ask one of the panelists, that's okay as well. And you might just tell us who you are as well, please. So any takers? Is that here? I see a hand down there in the back row. Thank you for being the first question. It's never an easy position.
Thank you. I'm Niamh Hardyman from UCD. Thanks to everyone on the panel for a really interesting discussion, and for the Commission itself for producing a really great report. I'm really struck by how much of the panel discussion is centering on the conversations that need to be had, and more generally the sort of mental pictures that we have in Ireland about the tax and welfare system and how they relate to each other. And I'd like to maybe just offer something. I don't really have a particular question. This is more of a comment than a question, so I'll try not to be too self-indulgent in what I say. There's usually a cue for like a 15-minute ramble. I do think that we have not been very good at thinking about the notion of fiscal contract in Ireland. I think that for a long time we have had a very individualistic way of thinking about tax and welfare separately and together, and it has been enhanced by the way a whole set of policies have been designed and the way they relate to each other. And I think that we do have this knotty thing, you know, when Brian was asked directly, how do we change the conversation? It's really difficult because policies and ideas and institutions get cooked together over time, and you can't make radical change in them at any one time. But what I think we can start doing is to understand how the institutions have framed ideas that have underpinned the policies. And the ideas are where we need to start. So I think the framing has tended to be very much about individual participation in the market, and this is what has caused us to design tax systems that relieve a lot of people, as we would say, from tax burdens, the better to create a flexible job market. But the loss involved there is that large numbers of people are not fiscally contracted into the state, don't have a stake in the state. It has consequences. We also have a way of talking about the economy and talking about the role of the state in the economy that thinks of the state as something other than the state or the society. The state sets the rules and then gets out of the way and lets the market get on with it. And this is not just kind of 40 years of neoliberalism. This is I think, part of the way our party political system has worked for a long time. But I do, and we know that that model of market knows best is fundamentally compromised with the great financial crisis, but we don't really have an alternative way of thinking about the way in which the wealth and resources of the whole society are generated through collective input and endeavour, so that it's not my money, don't take my money from me in taxes, I look after myself in this very sort of Americanized way. We do maybe have an opening now to change the way we talk about the way collective resources are managed and allocated. And I think that it is possibly an inflection point, even in the middle of a cost of living crisis, because I think that so much of the public debate now is about precisely the kind of collective resources and services that Mary was talking about.
Thank you very much for that.
Sorry, thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Mary, can I ask you, arising out of that as well, in terms of, and Niamh mentioned this, it's in the report, and the aging demographic is how, in terms of persuading young people that they should be paying tax, that whole issue of paying tax for older people. You mentioned citizens' assemblies earlier, and that, but that's a hard sell. But it's going to become a bigger and bigger issue, isn't it? As to when you look at the numbers. And I'm curious.
I don't think we should have a citizens' assembly, let's say, but it is interesting. Like some of the conversations that have arisen out of the citizens' assembly, or connected with it, like in the repeal referendum, the marriage equality referendum, and there's going to be a drug citizens' assembly. They have actually led into national conversations that have helped us reframe values and have helped us move on in some respects. So don't want a citizens' assembly, but it is interesting. How do you have those conversations? And if you see in the universities now,
how do you create the solidarity?
Yeah, like universities now are having very big conversations about consent, which is really, really hard to get their heads around. And I've seen students really, really trying to understand it. So I would think if we could find a way of having the conversation, that a lot of young people might even be more ahead of us in the conversation to some degree. I wouldn't assume that negativity about paying for older people or whatever is necessarily their starting point in how they understand their future. And I do think some of it has to be about, I think as Niamh was saying, just that conversation about what kind of society do we want is really important. And as a republic, Ireland hasn't necessarily, it doesn't feel to me like what I thought it would be like to live in a republic, in the sense of what you might imagine would be that sense of that interconnectedness that people who live in a republic should have. But it is never too late. I'm inclined to think that we will need a fairly significant new social settlement and an opportunity for new social contracts to be talked about in the context of constitutional change, north and south as well. And there's some really good opportunities there to, not to wipe the slate clean, but to have that conversation about what kind of island do we want as a proxy for what kind of society we want. And I do think we have learned things about how to have conversations in Ireland, right down to kitchen conversations about families arguing about their values, about what kind of society they want for their young women, for example. And they have been good outcomes from some of those conversations. So I'm an eternal optimist anyway, but I do think that it's worth getting those lessons, because, I mean, Brian said he's not an expert in how you communicate something, but we actually have got experts in Ireland who have shown very well that they can change people's minds. And if that's what we need to do here, I think, I wouldn't be that negative that we can't do it.
Brian, briefly before we go back, would you agree that is what we need to do here? In terms of, if we're to have significant change or to get buy-in, that the conversation will have to be grown and developed from where it's currently at? Yes,
but I think we're not really sure about the ground on which we're walking, even in terms of thinking about tax versus social insurance. In that we have a sort of a general sense, and I think probably policymakers have a general sense that it's easier to raise PRSI than it is to raise income tax, or it's easier to widen the numbers, and that's that's a very basic thing about people's attitudes to what they're doing when they're something is taken out of their payroll.
Do you think that the progress or lack of on property tax is a good example of that?
Yeah, it absolutely is, and I'm not entirely convinced that framing that, for example, as an intergenerational issue or intergenerational fracture point is the most helpful way to make headway on that discussion. Even though it's the way that it's very much being talked about at present.
Yeah. Now, anybody else? Yep, just here. Oh,
Sean Healy from Social Justice Ireland. I just want to make 2 points. One is about content and the other is about process. when I saw the title, The Fiscal Social Contract, when I got the invitation, that scares me, and I'll tell you why. It has a danger that we begin to look at the social contract in too narrow a way. And it seems to me that we have a problem with the social contract at the moment, and that into the future, we need to recognize that there are a number of different dimensions to the social contract. There's the economy, there's services, there's taxation, there's participation. We've talked a little bit here, but I think more and more people are demanding a voice in shaping the decisions that impact on them. And finally, there's the issue of sustainability. Now, the thing that we need to cotton on to, I think, more and in practice, as against in theory, we buy it all right, but in actual development and running of a social contract, is that these things are interconnected, they interact, and they're interdependent. And that consequently, I would worry about a fiscal social contract. The fiscal is a part of a greater social contract. And unless we deal with all 5 dimensions, we will wind up, again, with a lopsided approach towards it. For quite some time, we've been giving priority to the economy as the key, and that and everything else will follow if we get the economy right, that kind of idea. And I think that's part of what's contributed to the fracture in the social contract. So just to make that as a general point, and that's the content point. The second point I wanted to make has to do with process. And I sort of precede my comments on this by saying I was very involved, very interested in the Commission on Taxation and Welfare. We made a very substantial input to it, and we would be very positive about huge parts of it, of its report. However, I don't agree that the 116 recommendations are all based on evidence. In fact, I'm absolutely certain that in 1 or 2 cases, they're not. There's huge gaps in the evidence as presented. And what I'm finding interesting now is that there is no process to impact on that. Because we've been trying for the last few months, and, since we kind of went through the report and came up with some issues on this, and I don't want to get into the detail here. That's not what this is about today. But there is a question about people like a group of civil servants are sent off with a group of experts, and they come up with something. Could be, and it's very, very good document in a whole range of fronts. But if there are weaknesses in it, it seems to me that there must be a process for tackling that problem. And at this moment, it doesn't exist, because we have tried quite an amount of routes to try and deal with it. Now, I think that's going to apply to any work that's done on the social contract in the period ahead. And I agree with Mary that we're going to have lots of opportunities in the foreseeable future to actually engage with major topics on this, and major discussions, hopefully, about an integrated, overarching social contract. And that may well involve North and South as well. But either way, even if it doesn't, we need a process to ensure that infallibility isn't tied to a small group of people, or some people aren't invested with infallibility. And that's, as I say, again, what I said at the beginning, I think the work of the Commission was excellent. And a lot of the recommendations, I think, are superb. And I would be very positive about that. Thank you.
Sean, thank you very much for that. Now, we are in the market for a question. Here, just here.
Hi, my name is Louise O'Sullivan. I am a lecturer in TUD. I lecture taxation and financial reporting. So I suppose I have my own point, and then I have a question straight after. So my point is just more so on, say, education, that like when you actually speak to people, and like anyone you speak to, they all say, oh, I'm paying 50%. I'm paying 50%. But then when you actually, like anyone I break down, like when I go down home, I'm from West Cork, and I talk to my uncle who's a farmer, he reckons he's paying 50%. And when I actually break down and explain it to him, he might only be paying 12. Or like when I talk to my friends that are in the corporate world, And the same again, they don't get tax credits or any reliefs out there. So a lot of it would be education, not knowing the system, not understanding. And then also, like, say the minimum pricing or the price of cigarettes and things, they're like, Ireland is a rip-off. But the reasoning behind that, why we've brought them in, people don't know. So when I bring that into my classroom, like, the students are mesmerized. They think I'm the most intelligent person going, like, as if I came up with it. So I'm like, I didn't come up with this, but this is why it's there. And then even telling 19, 20-year-olds that cigarettes are this price because of this reason or whatever, you know, getting through to them, they're like, that's actually very smart. Or, you know, so when the conversation completely turns and they're asking loads and loads of questions. So when I teach financial reporting, no interest. When I teach things that's absolutely relative to them and they actually understand it and that's real life, they actually come in and they can ask more questions. Or they were like, oh, I talked to mum and dad and they asked it, you know. So they're coming in, going home, having those conversations and then coming in to me to even ask more. So again, their parents aren't education on it either. So I think that's a key point. And when you asked about inheritance tax, like, is it fair to charge on people's wealth? But then the whole tax system is redistribution of wealth. You know, Adam Smith's canyons of taxation. So that's probably another point, you know, when you actually explain that to people. But anyway, I could keep talking. But my question is, you know, when you made the recommendations, how did you keep your own personal circumstances from giving the recommendations? Does that make sense?
That they didn't influence recommendations?
Yes.
Okay, and I presume you're directing that at Niamh. Sure, okay, Niamh.
Thank you for the question. And I think they're fantastic examples you're given about explaining tax. Because, Alison, just really briefly, I mean, you know, in terms of how tax operates, you go to the States, you go to the cash register, you think you're paying $5, bang, 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 you're suddenly paying 17. That gives you a very particular societal response to what tax means. So I do wonder sometimes if we need to think about how we present tax. So, you know, great point there. And another one is, well, that's been taxed already. You can't possibly tax a second time. Every time you buy anything that is subject to VAT, you're taxing income twice. So it's sort of getting those messages out there. But that's a great question about sort of how you keep your own views out of it. So I suppose I think a key thing to remember is I'm the chair, so I'm very much facilitating everybody in the room. So my views are neither here nor there. It's sort of trying to get the group of people to come to a consensus. And if I may, Alice, I mean, I think that's something that's worth, I think, reflecting on a little bit, in that just the importance of that kind of exercise, you know, standing back, a group of 12 people, different constituencies. And of course, none of us operate judges, nobody operates in a complete vacuum. So you bring your position in the world into the room, but you bring with it your evidence, your experience, and all the rest of it. So then you do get this sort of very rich, I think, debate. But yeah, I mean, I suppose here, this is where I think I'd sort of reinforce the importance of this kind of exercise. You're supported by a secretariat. You have experts in the room. You're debating issues. We met 26 times. We had over 100 briefing papers. I mean, the scale of what you're going through, it's a very, very big political, intellectual, personal exercise for everybody involved. So I think all of that goes into the mix, but I think I'm entirely confident at the end of it, what you are getting is this objective, and yet, you know, not scientific view, because, you know, tax is in the world.
Thank you. Yep.
Hi, Robert Sweeney from Task. Thanks, Mary, for the shout out. So kind of a comment, and then I'll say, do you agree with me or not, to turn it into a question. So a lot of the talk was about trying to build consent for taxation. And as Mary alluded to, nobody wants to really pay more tax. But if you look at across countries, some countries are more willing than others to pay tax. And no surprise that it's the Nordic countries where people are most willing to pay tax, because the quality of the public services is perceived to be very high, and the welfare state benefits a broad section of population. If you look at Ireland, public services, it's a very mixed bag. We have some success stories, education being one of them. Healthcare, surprisingly, is actually some very good outcomes. But there's some areas where we actually spend a lot of money, but we don't get good outcomes. One is housing. We spend a lot on housing. It's a kind of complicated story, very bureaucratic procedures in terms of procuring public housing. If you look at, say, transport, we're around about the middle, but we're a very congested city. And a lot of it is related to planning. We have a very scattered population. So in order to improve the quality of public services, it's going to be very difficult because some of it is just historical mistakes. We have a very scattered population, which makes public services a lot more expensive to service the population. So I'm wondering, do people agree with that, and how can we kind of improve public services? Because it seems like a lot of the problems are just historical legacies of issues. Now, there are some areas where we need to spend more, such as care, childcare, elder care. So.
Okay. Who would like to? Mary, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it goes back to that question of trust, because if citizens feel that they have an evidence base, that they don't get value for tax via their public services, then they're not going to be inclined to want to invest in that tax. I mean, if we look at some of the attempts that there have been to improve public services, I suppose Sláintecare is probably the most obvious example of a significant reform agenda that's in progress, but really, really difficult to implement, that we do see that there are serious issues in relation to trying to implement reforms in the delivery of public services in Ireland. So I think you've hit on a very serious issue there in terms of the challenge there are. And maybe it relates to what Brian and what Sean Healy said as well, is the danger of seeing something as just tax and welfare, and not seeing it as the composite whole that people experience and make their judgments on. So a lot of people don't get that connected with the welfare system except at pension age, and they're not that conscious of what the welfare system is giving, but they are conscious of what they're paying out for private services, because they're not able to access them as public services, and therefore they're less inclined to value the payment of tax in that regard. So I think to some degree it goes back to that argument as well, that whatever way you're trying to develop those public services, the universality of them, the relevance of them to the greater number of people is a way of building up the public support for the base of revenue that should fund those public services. So even though universality is more expensive, I think it is something we need to talk about more as a way of looking at the future reforms, because we think we're saving money by targeting, but actually in the very long term, if you look at what the global challenges are, universality may have a much more fundamental part to play in how we see our future rolling out there than we do at present. So.
Brian, do you have any thoughts on that, on Mary's thoughts there on the universality?
Well, in fact, I think it goes back to something that was said earlier about social insurance and pay-related social insurance, that the arguments at the time for moving away from the earnings-related payments was to boost the lowest payments, but the dynamic implications of that may be to undermine the breadth of support for the system more generally. And so you can make a sort of political economy argument for what look to be not very well targeted payments. And I think that absolutely spreads over into the logic that Mary was just articulating for, in some instances, universality. But I think the challenge faced, of course, is that, as Robert said, I mean, it is the case that in some instances we're spending a lot of money and not getting very good value. I was reading the latest OECD report on Ireland, and it has a treatment of health expenditure, and one of the points it makes is that we're getting poorer outcomes than we should be in comparative terms for the amount that we're spending. And that's before you think about the problem of dealing with an aging population and so on. So in terms of who's the chicken and who's the egg, I think it's absolutely the case that not the mythical efficiency savings that politicians often tend to be focusing on, but genuine system improvements that get us better outputs for what we're spending are required across public spending generally, but particularly in health. And just as a sort of a slightly random analogue in terms of how difficult it is to make the case for more taxation, I mean, the debate or the experience in the UK over the last number of years about funding social care has been pretty salutary, in that there have been various expert reports saying, coming up with pretty sensible funding mechanisms, and these eventually were taken up by governments of different stripes, including very recently, but fell at the last fence because of a sort of an ideological resistance to increasing tax. And that's in a case where there's the most compelling case to be made that is not difficult to communicate, to go back to the communication point, because nobody has to look very far to think of people who need this support. So a fair insurance-based mechanism to provide it would seem like a no-brainer, but in some contexts, even that is impossible to sell. So I think it's very, very context-specific, and that goes back to some of the points that were made earlier about maybe this is a moment where a conversation can be had that's productive.
Thank you, Brian. Any other? Yep. John Fitzgerald there.
Hi, John Fitzgerald, Trinity. The last two elections, the political manifestos had very little on welfare systems. And if you compare it to manifestos of the 70s and the 80s, where it was a real issue of debate, your commission was on tax and social welfare received less attention also in it. What do you see as it's forward-looking? What do you see as the big challenges for the future? And Brian has identified one, in that if you watch the debate in Britain, truly horrifying things have happened to the welfare system and nobody seems to worry about it or do anything about it. There is the lack of interest in the welfare system going to be a challenge in the future?
Niamh, maybe you'd take that.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question, and it kind of brings me back to this sense that this was very distinctive about our work. It was the tax and welfare nexus, and we were very conscious of it, that this was something we really had to keep at the forefront. Partly it was sort of just how they both worked together, but partly, how do you think about welfare and kind of the world we're in right now, and even the word welfare. I mean, it's this notion, I think, of participation and supporting people so that they can participate fully in what the economy looks like right now. So to me, in terms of the future challenge, I think it's that. I think it's understanding what it means to be on the expenditure side of that relationship. Is it sort of lifelong learning opportunities for people once they leave college over time? Is it the souped up social security fund where for 3 months you get the same salary? Is it issues related to sort of regionalisation and how we support people working from home? These are slightly high-level examples, but I think it's thinking about it like that. I mean, one of our recommendations, I think it was a very powerful one, it was that we do not tax child benefit, and that we do think about a second tier of child benefit. So I think it's thinking about sort of the pressures on families and society as we evolve, and embracing this participatory sense of welfare. That's something we all have a stake in. Yes, in crisis, but not always. There's a life cycle to how you engage with the welfare system.
Mary?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, John, that the conversation about welfare is relatively muted given to what it would have been in the 80s and 90s, and maybe it's just a feature of low unemployment and it being less a salient issue. But I do think it probably, if there was, I mean, as a critical friend, if one was going to make comment on the welfare recommendations in the Commission, and I don't know if Brian would agree with me, but both of us sat on 2011 to 2014 expert working group on integration of tax and welfare, very much a working age kind of report, and got ourselves into a lot of very technical details about things that didn't go anywhere and didn't create a conversation. So one thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about, and we weren't talked about at all. It just got buried in somebody's drawer. But it did reflect, when I was looking at the recommendations on welfare broadly speaking, and even things on working age payments and things like that, is that when you go to do them in the real nuts and bolts of it, computer says no, administrative systems say no, it becomes really, really difficult to design it in a way that it won't end up being a second version of a universal credit, let's say. And the report was very clear on saying we're not going down universal credit, but it's actually really hard to integrate tax and welfare systems in a working age context, single working age payment kind of idea. So I do think that the recommendations of the report probably reflect a lack of maybe deeper consideration about the welfare issues than maybe there was for some of the tax issues. And that's fair enough, but I do think that when it comes to looking at some of the recommendations, that there will be much more heavy lifting to do in making sense of them, and that some of them may fall at the wayside because they're difficult to make sense of in moving them on, and that might happen.
Do you want to pick up on that, Niamh, and in terms of the welfare aspect of it?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in many respects, this is one of the big challenges we had, because if you think about welfare, you know, you're just into this huge territory. Where do you draw the line between expenditure and the piece of welfare that we were engaged with? So I think, you know, Mary, they're very interesting points you've made. I think, look, I think absolutely that is a critique one could make. I think when you're looking at welfare in particular, it is unavoidable to think about how it gets done, how the systems get done. And I think going to points some colleagues have been making earlier about political economy, did you think about this, did you think about that? When it comes to welfare, you have to think about what's, I think, possible and achievable and doable in terms of systems. So I think our report was kind of pulling up to that level. These are sort of, we would like to get here, but the design of this really has to be kind of worked out somewhere. Yeah.
And how, I'm curious to know then, you mentioned there about the increased child benefit. How much is on your mind of thinking, you know, this one mightn't go down so well, but maybe if we put this in, it'll be more popular, and that you have to be realistic and think about how things are going to land, and palatability and sellability, and the whole intergenerational thing of one thing here, another thing there?
Well, I suppose, I think the first thing to say is, you know, it is a package of reforms, right? Yeah. So there's 116 of them. And they all come from a particular evidence base, a particular set of discussions. So looked at in the round, they are all speaking to answering this big question, you know, how are we going to fund ourselves and ensure we have, you know, sufficient welfare? So I think in all of this, there will be different views, and that's the brilliance and the wonder, if you like, of putting together a group of 12 people with particular expertise and constituencies, and it comes out the way it comes out. But I think we were always very conscious, and I think you see it in the exec summary, that this is something that will take time. I think that's a key thing, Alison. It was never meant to be for this budgetary cycle or even the next one. And that as it's worked through, and we would hope the 116 are worked through, but that each one and its fit with the other one is worked through in terms of specific distributional issues, specific design issues, and so on, so that the system works.
Can I link, and I'm going to come back to the floor now in 1 second. Can I link to that we'll say, if you were a commission that had been asked to do a similar job in France, for instance, where there's very different attitudes to all of these things, you would obviously bring a set of different beliefs, understandings, all of that. And I'm wondering, so you're not in France, you're in Ireland, and you were also delivering it to a particular political system. So there was a question earlier about bringing your own personal beliefs. In this instance, it's producing a report and many recommendations to a particular political system. Does that factor in, again, in the whole palatability, the possibility of thinking, well, will this one run? What's the chances of success on this?
I think it's slightly...
And that isn't even in relation to a particular party or parties being in government. I suppose it's that we have a pretty steady and stable political system. You know, in recent years, certainly it hasn't, or generally doesn't tend to waver too much.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's a couple of things that come into play here. I mean, I think there is a sense that of not wanting to break anything, and I mean that in a serious way, that the Irish economic model, and absolutely there are important critiques one can make of it, but nonetheless, over the last 30 years, we have seen significant increases in quality of living, and we've seen a reduction in inequality. We know that by the time the tax and welfare system do their job, we end up with lower levels of income inequality than we do before they kind of get traction. So I think that's relevant. And I think in terms of the political context, I mean, look, like I said at the start, you've got the representative political process and you've got everything else that's feeding into it, of which we are a part. So I think the hope is that we are here as a credible, trustworthy body and report that will feed whatever government we have over the next sort of 5, 10, 15 years.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Now, just here.
Patrick Honohan, just listening to the conversation, it seems to me that, okay, you had your 5 principles, which are very, very high level and fully agree with them. And then you have your 116 recommendations. And some of these recommendations didn't go down very well, and you've talked about that. And even Sean Healy doesn't seem to agree with 1 or 2 of them or something. But I'm wondering, is there an intermediate level of guidelines or something like that, do's and don'ts, that you would say to a government, whatever you do, don't do this. Or if you're going to do that, don't do it in that direction, do it in this direction. Can we distill something like that from your report that would allow people to say, okay, I didn't agree with this and I didn't agree with that, but their overall approach is so coherent that it gives us a guideline so that if some minister comes up with a great idea that's very popular in his constituency, that other people will say, look, that's completely against the whole thrust of the way these people were thinking and the way we can as a nation buy into this.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm going to turn to Niamh now, and I'm going to be relieved that I'm not the one answering that question.
Niamh's practically making notes. That's a superb question. So let me allow I think this is what I would say. I think, so first of all, I think thanks, Patrick, because I think there is, and this is where I encourage everybody to read the 500 pages, because I think in the text of the report, there is this richness of debate about how we got from 5 principles to 116 recommendations. And I think to the extent there's repeating themes, I think I would go with things like this. Be very wary of eroding the tax system. So once the tax is in place and you've got through the difficult political economy and it's doing a job, I think not eroding the sort of taxes, is something to be mindful of. I think secondly, the resilience and coherence of the tax system. Now look, it's a construct of people and politics, right? So it's never going to be this perfectly constructed machine. But once you've got a degree of sort of resilience and stability, I think it's, for example, something we say in the report, not using certain tax levers to deliver short-term outcomes that are incontrovertible, they need to happen. But that could be an expenditure lever. That the tax lever is a more permanent contract you have with everybody. So not using the tax system to deliver something over kind of a year or two. So I think keeping it resilient. And I'm trying to look at sort of my last note here. Oh yes, I can see what I'm saying. I think it's the really basic point, Patrick, about broaden the base. And I'm going, excuse me, I'm very struck by what Brian said at the start about broaden the base, but will you get much out of it? And you made the very interesting point about sort of inheritance tax. And I think it's a very interesting point you made there about the household balance sheet. But I suppose one of the things I'd say here is, if we think about what we look like now to what we looked like 50 years ago, in terms of what the household balance sheet looks like, right? So in terms of income is coming in one way. Now we know we have housing wealth, we have deposit-based wealth, we have different ways in which we construct wealth, very, very broadly defined, if you like. So I think it's a sense of imagination of looking across tax bases, because they change, and how we hold wealth and income changes over time. So I think it's not keeping this constant lens on taxes on labour, because going to a point you mentioned, Alison, and the political economy of this, that's really difficult. That's the visible one, that's the distributional one, or it looks distributional. You're paying 42% as opposed to 40%. So I think it's that sort of broadening the tax base and keeping it as broad as possible.
Okay. Brian, might you take up the point there?
I think if you look on the welfare side, so maybe to complement a little bit what Niamh was saying, if you look on the welfare side, what I read from the report is the importance of strengthening social insurance. And I think that's a radically different route to, as John mentioned, the one that was followed in the UK. And I think that as a fundamental direction of travel is huge, provides you with some guidelines that you want to minimize rather than enhance the degree of means testing in the system, and that you want to minimize the degree of, or you want to maximize the extent to which people can, on social welfare, can make their own decisions about their lives rather than looking over their shoulders all the time. So I think that it's not obvious to me that necessarily follows through all the way in the precise recommendations, but I think as an orientation, to go back to the notion of reciprocity, that if that's the basis on which the social protection system is being designed, rather than on a very strict maximising targeting, maximising means testing in order to achieve it, that maybe is a bit of a parallel to the base broadening on the tax side.
Do you agree with that, Mary? Do you think it's achievable?
I agree that that's what it does, but I would prefer if it didn't. In that I think there's an opportunity missed maybe to think less about maybe if we define welfare as a very productivist idea of welfare, that it's about welfare and work nexus, which I think is probably what we do it in Ireland. And even we think of child benefit and it's what impact does it have on work incentives. That's a reason not to tax it. That's a reason to have a secondary tier. It's about child poverty as well, but it has to be done in the context of maintaining work incentives. I think there's a really narrow frame around how we understand what the principles of welfare need to respect in order to develop the welfare system. I think if we understood it more as maybe well-being and care or something like that, we would do quite different things.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, if we saw that, if it kind of goes back to maybe what kind of society do we want? And if we want a society where of the workers and everybody's working in a very productive sense of the word, that we're really valorising paid work, we're socially valuing a very narrow range of activities that people actually do value and do in their lives. I do think that there's a place for the welfare system to socially value a whole broad range of activities that we need in society to make society work, particularly care, but also democratic activity, environmental activity, culture, art. I mean, there's so much we do in life that makes life worthwhile, that allows us to flourish, that the lives we want to live, that we don't socially value, we don't support, we don't enable, we nearly punish people for doing it rather than supporting them. And I think if we were really thinking about what way do we want our tax and welfare system to enable the type of lives and worlds we want to live in and to be in, that we might have a different conversation than one that simply says, is everybody working as much as they can? Are we taxing them as much as we can in order to keep that cycle of quite narrow vision of how the world works going? That's what I mean by that, I suppose,
And certainly I think the caring one we are going to, with the upcoming referendum, we're certainly going to see far more.
Yeah, and we'll see there the absence of the tax and welfare imagination, I think, in how we do socially value care. You know,
Thank you, Mary. We do have time for one more brief question, if somebody wanted to ask one. Yep. Go on, Siobhan, thank you. Was there somebody? No, was there another hand that I missed? No. Yeah.
So it's just to follow on from Mary's comments there, I suppose, because this comes back to about taxation and how it can be applied for social good. And I suppose then it depends on how one defines a social good. And so that was my question to Niamh about how did the Commission go about actually agreeing the principles? Because of course no policy is ever value free. and it, you know, in deciding which principles you would choose in order to frame the discussion, you know, you see it through a particular lens. You've already, to some extent, decided what the social good should be. So I was wondering, in a sense, whether so I'd be really interested to know how you managed to reach consensus on what the principles were. And then again, to Mary's point, the principles, of course, then can be interpreted in lots of different ways. I mean, we talked about reciprocity. You can look at that transversally or horizontally, at an individual or a collective level. So there's all sorts of interesting things, because it strikes me when we talk about trust and trustworthiness, if we take the principles that the Commission, and personally I think they're very good, but are they widely embraced by society? Are those the principles that Irish society would consider are going to deliver social good? And how does one go about defining that?
Okay. Nice rock breaker to end. Thank you, Siobhan. Cheers, Niamh.
I know it's a great way of kind of wrapping this up. Well, look, I suppose
very good last question.
I could give this. I think there's two ways of answering it, right? One is functionalist. How do we do it? So I think we realised that given the scale of the TOR, and given that we had a year, and given, I think, as many colleagues have pointed out, it's all about choices. It's all about separating yourself from the issue. How do you keep yourself honest as you do that? Well, I think having a catalogue of normative principles is one of the ways to do that. So, you know, how do we do it? We talked a lot. We looked at previous commissions, adequacy from the Commission on Welfare in the 80s. Efficiency is obviously a huge principle from Merlees and indeed de Beauclerk and other commissions. And then you reading a lot and sort of, you know, you're in the world, so obviously sustainability is a huge issue. But I completely take your point, Yvonne. Would everybody in the room, in this room or any room, consider that perhaps reciprocity, maybe it should be solidarity, maybe it should be something else? So that's then where you're into the wider debate about what is it we're trying to do here. And I think we feel that those framing principles were guardrails that got us to where we needed to be. Now, in the course of the year, you're obviously flexing and moving and checking back, and does it still work, and are we still using that one? So it's iterative. And I think we found as we went through that they were resilient. They did allow us to end up where we ended up. And they also acted as a sense check. If we're saying X, does this fit with Y? So I think in many respects, that was one of the most sort of fruitful and powerful discussions we had. And even something like sustainability, and going back to, I think, the comment Mary was making, I think a very powerful comment about the collective versus the individual. It's not just fiscal sustainability, it is that much wider sense of sustainability. And I'm very struck by your point about the collective and not just the individual, because the scale of the problems we're dealing with, they are global, they are collective. And I think we were trying to infuse that in our report in terms of how we think about really all aspects of the system. But no, thank you, because I think that was something we put a lot of thought into. And hopefully it will, as the debate continues, these principles we challenge, of course they will, and we would want them to be, but they are out there as a way of thinking about these issues.
Thank you, Niamh. I think there was a very comprehensive final answer. And when I was preparing earlier and looking at the report, I was struck in Niamh's forward, and it's summarising where she said taxation and welfare systems are fundamental to our well-being, our standards of living and our prosperity. And then she goes on later to say they represent the obligation we owe to each other and the protection we provide for each other. And I think that was going into it. I felt that the debate, you know, the debate tonight needed to explore that. And I think I hope at any rate that we got into all the different areas of this that you, the audience, wanted explored, and in an interesting way. And I think it's been a really interesting way to have looked at the report. And I suppose ultimately it's quite obvious that Niamh and her colleagues worked incredibly hard in a short timescale, and that what is the point in doing something like that unless afterwards it results in discussion and results in action, and I suppose in people realising what it is that has been done and what has been recommended. So I would really like to thank Niamh and Mary and Brian very much for what I thought were really, and I'm sure you'll agree, really valuable and insightful contributions, and thank you all for for listening so intently. Thank you.